The Harrison mansion stood at the end of Maple Avenue like a beautiful prison. Its white columns and perfectly trimmed gardens told the world that the people inside had everything money could buy. But money could not buy peace in this house. Money could not buy happiness for the small boy who lived on the third floor. And money certainly could not keep a nanny employed for more than 3 weeks. Victoria Harrison sat in her study, her fingers pressing against her temples. She was a woman of 42 years, elegant in her designer clothes, powerful in her business dealings, but completely helpless when it came to her 7-year-old son, Marcus. The boy had driven away 17 nannies in the past 2 years. 17 women had walked through those grand doors with hope in their eyes and professional smiles on their faces. 17 women had left crying, some with scratches on their arms, some with their belongings thrown from the third-floor window, and all of them with the same words on their lips. That child is impossible. Victoria's husband, Richard Harrison, was rarely home. He ran a shipping company that kept him traveling across continents. When he was home, he had no patience for Marcus and his behavior. He believed the boy needed discipline, strict rules, and consequences. But nothing worked. Marcus had been to 3 different therapists. He had been tested for every condition imaginable. The doctors said he was simply a difficult child with anger issues stemming from emotional neglect. Victoria hated those words. She had given Marcus everything. Private schools, expensive toys, the best clothes, trips to Disneyland, a room filled with video games. How could anyone call that neglect? The latest nanny had quit just that morning. Her name was Sandra, a woman in her 50s with 30 years of experience in childcare. She had lasted exactly 11 days. On the 11th day, Marcus had locked her in the basement pantry for 4 hours. When the housekeeper finally heard her screaming and let her out, Sandra had marched straight to Victoria's study and resigned on the spot. She had called Marcus a demon. She had said there was something deeply wrong with that child. And then she had demanded her payment and left without looking back. Now Victoria sat alone, staring at the list of nanny agencies on her computer screen. She had already burned through the top 5 agencies in the city. Word had spread about the Harrison boy. Good nannies refused to even interview. The agencies that still answered her calls sent only desperate women who needed work badly enough to ignore the warnings. But desperation was not enough to survive Marcus Harrison. The phone on Victoria's desk rang. She answered it without enthusiasm. It was Martha, her oldest friend and the wife of a senator. Martha had heard about the latest nanny disaster through the social circle gossip. She called to offer advice. Martha told Victoria about a woman named Grace Johnson. Grace was not a professional nanny. She was a housekeeper who had worked for Martha's family for 2 years before moving to care for her sick mother in another state. Now Grace was back in the city, and her mother had passed away. She was looking for work. Martha said Grace had a gift with difficult children. Martha's own son, who had struggled with ADHD and behavioral problems, had transformed during Grace's time with their family. The boy had loved Grace like a second mother. Victoria listened with skepticism. She had heard similar recommendations before. Everyone thought their suggestion would be the one to finally work. But no one understood how truly difficult Marcus was. Still, she was desperate. She asked Martha to send Grace's contact information. The next afternoon, Grace Johnson arrived at the Harrison mansion for an interview. Victoria watched from the window as an older black woman walked up the driveway. Grace appeared to be in her late 50s, with gray streaks in her hair and a calm expression on her face. She wore simple clothes, nothing fancy, just clean and neat. She carried no briefcase full of certifications or references. She simply walked to the front door and rang the bell like she was visiting an old friend. Victoria met her in the formal living room. She had prepared a long list of questions, the same questions she had asked all the other candidates. Questions about experience, education, methods of discipline, emergency training. But before Victoria could begin, Grace spoke first. Grace asked about Marcus, not about his behavior problems or his history with nannies. She asked what he liked to do, what made him laugh, what his favorite food was, what stories he liked to hear before bed. Victoria was caught off guard. No one had ever asked those questions first. She realized with shame that she did not know most of the answers. She knew Marcus liked video games, but she did not know which ones. She knew he ate whatever the cook prepared, but she could not name his favorite meal. She knew he went to bed at 8 o'clock, but she could not remember the last time she had read him a story. Grace nodded slowly as Victoria stumbled through her uncertain answers. There was no judgment in Grace's eyes, only understanding. She told Victoria that children who act out are usually children who feel invisible. They cause trouble because trouble gets attention. Even negative attention feels better than no attention at all. Victoria felt defensive. She explained that she was a busy woman. She had a company to run. Her husband was away most of the time. That was why they hired nannies, to give Marcus the attention he needed. Grace smiled gently. She said that hired attention was not the same as family attention, but she also said she was not there to judge. She was there to help if Victoria would give her the chance. Victoria warned Grace about Marcus. She told her about the 17 nannies. She told her about the locked pantry incident. She told her about the time Marcus had cut up a nanny's passport with scissors. She told her about the screaming fits, the thrown objects, the cruel words that came from his small mouth. She wanted Grace to understand exactly what she was walking into. Grace listened to everything without changing her expression. When Victoria finished, Grace simply asked when she could start. Victoria felt a mixture of hope and guilt. Hope that maybe this woman would be different. Guilt that she was about to subject another person to her son's wrath. She told Grace she could start the next morning. That night, Victoria went to Marcus's room to tell him about the new nanny. She found him sitting on the floor surrounded by Lego pieces. He did not look up when she entered. She told him that a woman named Grace would be coming to take care of him starting tomorrow. Marcus's response was cold. He said he would make her leave just like all the others. He said no one could make him behave. He said he did not need a nanny. He needed his mother to stay home. Victoria felt the words like a slap. She wanted to sit down next to him. She wanted to hold him and promise to change. But her phone was buzzing in her pocket. There was always something urgent. There was always somewhere else she needed to be. She told Marcus to behave himself and left the room. Marcus picked up a Lego piece and threw it at the closed door. Grace arrived at 7 the next morning. She came through the kitchen entrance rather than the grand front door. The cook, an older man named Bernard, looked surprised to see a new face. He had seen so many nannies come and go that he had stopped bothering to learn their names. Grace introduced herself and asked if she could make her own breakfast. Bernard shrugged and pointed to the refrigerator. Grace made herself eggs and toast. She sat at the small kitchen table and ate slowly, looking around at the massive kitchen with its professional equipment and cold steel surfaces. She asked Bernard how long he had worked for the family. Bernard said 8 years. He said he stayed because the pay was good and the work was easy. Mrs. Harrison was never home for meals. Mr. Harrison was almost never home at all. The boy ate alone most of the time, whatever Bernard put in front of him. Bernard did not know what the boy actually liked because the boy never said thank you or complained or showed any reaction to the food. Grace asked what time Marcus usually came down for breakfast. Bernard laughed bitterly. He said Marcus did not come down. The nannies brought food up to his room. The boy refused to eat at the dining table. He refused to eat anywhere except his room. One nanny had tried to force him to come downstairs, and he had thrown his breakfast plate at her head. Grace thanked Bernard for the information. She finished her breakfast, washed her own dishes, and headed upstairs. The 3rd floor of the mansion was Marcus's territory. It had been converted into a child's paradise, with a playroom filled with every toy imaginable, a small movie theater, a room just for video games, and a bedroom that was bigger than most apartments. But despite all the luxury, the floor felt lonely. The toys looked untouched. The movie theater chairs were dusty. Everything was perfect and expensive and completely without warmth. Grace found Marcus in his bedroom. He was still in his pajamas, lying on his bed with a tablet in his hands, playing some game that made loud shooting noises. He did not look up when Grace knocked on the open door. Grace said good morning. She introduced herself and said she would be spending time with him from now on. She did not say she was his new nanny. She did not say she was there to take care of him or watch him or make sure he behaved. Marcus finally looked up. His eyes scanned Grace from head to toe with a cold assessment that seemed too mature for a 7-year-old. He asked if she was the new nanny. Grace said she was just Grace. She asked if she could come in. Marcus shrugged and went back to his game. He said she could do whatever she wanted. She would be gone in a week anyway. Grace did not argue. She walked into the room and sat down in an armchair near the window. She did not try to take the tablet away. She did not tell Marcus to get dressed or eat breakfast. She simply sat there, looking out the window at the garden below. Minutes passed in silence except for the sounds of Marcus's game. He kept glancing at Grace, expecting her to say something, to give him an order, to try to control him somehow, but she just sat there peacefully, as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do than sit in that chair. After about 20 minutes, Marcus paused his game. He asked Grace what she was doing. Grace said she was sitting. She said it was a nice room with a nice view. Marcus seemed confused. He said she was supposed to make him get dressed. She was supposed to make him eat breakfast. She was supposed to tell him what to do. Grace asked if he wanted to get dressed and eat breakfast. Marcus said no. Grace said, "Okay." She went back to looking out the window. Another 10 minutes passed. Marcus turned off his game and sat up in bed. He stared at Grace with suspicious eyes. He told her he knew what she was doing. She was trying to trick him with reverse psychology. His therapist had tried the same thing. Grace asked him what reverse psychology was. Marcus explained it impatiently. He said it was when someone pretended not to care so that you would do what they wanted anyway. Grace nodded. She said that sounded exhausting. She said she was not smart enough for tricks like that. She was just an old woman who had been told to come here and spend time with him. She did not care if he got dressed or stayed in his pajamas. She did not care if he ate breakfast or stayed hungry. Those were his choices to make. She was just going to be there. Marcus did not know how to respond. Every adult in his life had always tried to control him. His mother scheduled every minute of his day before handing him off to nannies. His father barked orders like Marcus was one of his employees. His therapists tried to get inside his head with their clever questions. But this woman was just sitting there, asking nothing, expecting nothing. He got out of bed and walked toward Grace. He stood in front of her with his arms crossed. He said she was going to regret coming here. He said he was going to make her life miserable until she quit like all the others. Grace looked at him with soft eyes. She said he could try if he wanted to, but she had been through a lot in her life. Her husband had died when she was young. She had raised 3 children on her own while working 2 jobs. Her mother had been sick for years before passing away last month. She said she knew what misery felt like, and a little boy's anger was not going to add much to what she had already survived. Marcus was silent. He had expected fear or anger, or at least frustration. He had not expected honesty. He had not expected someone to talk to him like he was a person instead of a problem to be solved. He went back to his bed and picked up his tablet, but he did not turn on his game. He just held it in his hands, thinking. Grace continued to sit by the window. She started humming softly, an old song that her mother used to sing. The melody was simple and sad and strangely comforting. Marcus listened, without admitting he was listening. The morning sunlight came through the window and fell across the floor. For the first time in a long time, his room did not feel like a cage. Downstairs, Victoria was getting ready to leave for work. She asked Bernard if he had seen any signs of disaster yet. Bernard said no. He said everything was quiet upstairs. Victoria did not know if that was a good sign or just the calm before the storm. She grabbed her briefcase and headed out the door, trying not to think about what she might come home to. In his room, Marcus finally spoke again. He asked Grace about her mother. He asked what she had been sick with and how long it had taken her to die. Most adults would have scolded him for asking such personal questions so bluntly, but Grace answered honestly. She told him about her mother's cancer. She told him about the 2 years of treatment that did not work. She told him about holding her mother's hand in the hospital at the end. Marcus asked if she had cried. Grace said yes. She said she cried for weeks. Marcus said crying was for babies. Grace said crying was for humans. She said even strong people cry when they lose someone they love. She asked Marcus if he had ever lost someone. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said his grandmother had died when he was 5, his father's mother. He said no one had told him until after the funeral. His parents said he was too young to understand. He said he never got to say goodbye. Grace asked how that had made him feel. Marcus threw his tablet across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. He shouted that he did not want to talk about his feelings. He was not going to let her therapist him like everyone else. He told her to get out of his room. Grace stood up slowly. She said okay. She said she would be in the playroom if he wanted to find her later. She walked to the door and paused. She looked back at Marcus, who was now facing the wall with his fists clenched. She said she was sorry about his grandmother. She said it was not fair that he did not get to say goodbye. Then she left. Marcus stood alone in his room, breathing hard. He wanted to scream. He wanted to break something. But for some reason, the anger was mixed with something else, something that felt like being seen for the first time. He did not leave his room for the rest of the morning, but he also did not cause any trouble. When Bernard brought lunch upstairs, he found Marcus sitting quietly on his bed, staring at the wall where he had thrown his tablet. The tablet was still on the floor where it had fallen. Bernard asked if he should pick it up. Marcus said no. He said to leave it there. Bernard shrugged and left the lunch tray on the desk. Strange kid, he thought as he walked back downstairs. But at least nothing was broken today. Grace spent the afternoon in the playroom looking at all the untouched toys. She picked up a stuffed elephant that still had its price tag on and held it gently. She wondered how a child could be surrounded by so much and still feel so empty. At 5 o'clock, she heard small footsteps in the hallway. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the playroom. He had changed out of his pajamas into jeans and a t-shirt. His hair was messy and his eyes were red, but he was dressed. Grace pretended not to notice his red eyes. She held up the stuffed elephant and asked if it had a name. Marcus shook his head. He said he had never played with it. He said most of these toys were gifts from people who did not really know him. Relatives he saw once a year. Business friends of his parents. People who thought expensive toys could replace actual love. Grace set the elephant down. She asked Marcus what he actually liked to play with. He thought for a moment. Then he said he liked drawing, but his father said art was a waste of time. Boys should play sports or learn about business. Drawing was for girls. Grace asked if he could show her some of his drawings. Marcus hesitated. Then he nodded slowly. He led her back to his room and pulled a box from under his bed. Inside were dozens of drawings on crumpled paper. He had hidden them there so his parents would not throw them away. Grace sat on the floor and looked at each drawing carefully. They were not the scribblings of a typical 7-year-old. They had detail and emotion, dark images of storms and monsters and lonely figures standing in empty rooms, but also bright images of ships sailing toward distant islands and dragons flying through colorful skies. She told Marcus he was talented. She said these drawings showed that he had a big imagination and strong feelings. Marcus looked at her suspiciously, waiting for the catch, waiting for her to say something about how he should focus on school instead, or how maybe art therapy would help with his anger issues. But Grace just kept looking at the drawings with genuine interest. She asked about a picture of a red dragon. She asked where the dragon was flying to. Marcus sat down next to her. He said the dragon was flying away from a castle where no one wanted him. He was looking for a new home where someone would understand him. Grace nodded. She said that sounded like a brave dragon. She said starting over somewhere new was one of the hardest things anyone could do. They sat together on the floor of his room as the afternoon light faded. Grace asked questions about each drawing, and Marcus answered in more and more detail. For the first time in as long as he could remember, someone was listening to him. Really listening. When Victoria came home at 7 o'clock, she braced herself for the worst. She expected to find Grace in tears, ready to quit. She expected to hear about broken objects and screaming fits and cruel words. Instead, Bernard met her at the door with a confused expression. He said things had been quiet all day. Unsettlingly quiet. He said the new woman and the boy had spent the whole afternoon in his room. No screaming, no throwing things, nothing. Victoria went upstairs to investigate. She found Marcus's door open and looked inside. Grace was sitting in the armchair by the window. Marcus was on the floor, drawing in a sketchbook that Grace must have given him. Neither of them noticed Victoria standing in the doorway. Marcus was telling Grace about his picture. It was a boat on the ocean, sailing toward a sunset. He said the person on the boat was looking for treasure, not gold treasure, a different kind of treasure that was more important. Grace asked what kind of treasure. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said he did not know yet. He was still figuring it out. Victoria felt tears in her eyes. She could not remember the last time she had seen her son so calm, so engaged, so much like a normal child instead of the angry creature who had terrorized 17 nannies. She stepped back from the doorway without announcing her presence. She went to her study and sat down heavily in her chair. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this woman named Grace would be the one to finally reach her son. Or maybe this was just the first day, and the real storm was still coming. Only time would tell. 2 weeks passed at the Harrison mansion, and the house felt different. The staff noticed it first. Bernard the cook said the air felt lighter. The cleaning ladies said they no longer dreaded going to the 3rd floor. Even the gardener, who rarely came inside, mentioned that he could hear laughter coming from the upstairs windows when he worked near the house. Grace had not performed any miracles. She had not used fancy techniques from parenting books or tried to reform Marcus through strict discipline. She had simply been present. She listened when he talked. She sat quietly when he did not want to talk. She asked questions about his drawings and remembered his answers. She treated him like a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. Marcus still had difficult moments. One morning, he threw his breakfast on the floor because the eggs were too runny. Grace did not yell or threaten punishment. She simply cleaned up the mess and asked if he wanted to try making his own eggs. Marcus was surprised by the offer. He had never been allowed in the kitchen. His mother said it was dangerous for children to be near stoves and sharp knives. Grace took him downstairs and introduced him to Bernard properly. She asked Bernard to teach Marcus how to make scrambled eggs. Bernard looked doubtful. He had seen Marcus throw food and break dishes many times. But something in Grace's calm confidence made him agree. That morning, Marcus learned to crack an egg without getting shells in the bowl. He learned to stir gently while the eggs cooked. When he sat down to eat the eggs he had made himself, he declared they were the best eggs he had ever tasted. Bernard rolled his eyes, but Grace saw the small smile on the cook's face. Victoria watched these changes from a distance. She would come home from work and peek into Marcus's room, expecting to find chaos, finding peace instead. Grace and Marcus would be playing card games or building elaborate Lego structures or simply sitting together while Grace told stories about her childhood in Georgia. Victoria felt two things at once: relief that her son was finally calm, and jealousy that a stranger had achieved what she could not. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She should be grateful. She should be happy. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she wondered why her own son had never looked at her the way he looked at Grace. Richard Harrison returned home at the end of the second week. He had been in Singapore for 3 weeks, closing a major shipping deal. He walked through the front door, expecting the usual reports of nanny disasters and bills for damaged property. Instead, Victoria told him things had been peaceful. Richard was skeptical. He wanted to see for himself. He went upstairs to Marcus's room, where he found his son sitting at a small desk, drawing in his sketchbook. Grace was in the corner, reading a book. Richard stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He asked Marcus what he was drawing. Marcus looked up at his father with careful eyes. The boy had learned to be cautious around Richard. His father had a short temper and no patience for excuses. Marcus said he was drawing a ship. Richard walked over and looked at the drawing. It was detailed and skillful for a 7-year-old. The ship had 3 masts and full sails, cutting through waves toward a horizon filled with adventure. Richard grunted. He said it was not bad. Then he asked why Marcus was wasting time on pictures when he should be practicing his math and reading. He said Marcus would need to take over the family business someday. Ships required mathematics, not art. Grace set down her book and spoke gently. She said Marcus had been working on his reading every day. They read together for an hour each afternoon. She said drawing helped Marcus concentrate and express himself. Richard turned to look at Grace. His eyes moved over her plain clothes and gray hair with obvious assessment. He asked who she was. Grace introduced herself calmly. She said she had been helping with Marcus for 2 weeks. Richard looked at Victoria, who had followed him upstairs. He asked if this was the new nanny. Victoria said yes. She said Grace had been wonderful. Richard seemed unimpressed. He told Marcus to put away the drawings and come downstairs for dinner. They would eat together as a family for once. He turned and walked out without waiting for a response. Marcus's face changed. The peace that had settled over him in the past 2 weeks began to crack. He looked at Grace with worried eyes. Grace stood up and walked over to him. She put her hand on his shoulder and said it would be okay. She said he should go have dinner with his parents. She would be there when he got back. Marcus did not want to go. Dinners with his father were always stressful. Richard asked questions about school and expected perfect answers. He criticized Marcus for slouching, for eating too fast, for not making eye contact. Every meal felt like a test Marcus could not pass. But Grace gently encouraged him. She said she believed in him. She said he was stronger than he knew. Marcus took a deep breath and walked downstairs to the formal dining room. The table was set with fine china and silver utensils. Bernard had prepared roasted chicken with vegetables. Richard sat at the head of the table, already looking impatient. Victoria sat across from him, her phone face down beside her plate. Marcus took his seat and stared at his plate. The meal began in silence, except for the clink of silverware. Richard asked Marcus about school. What was he learning? What were his grades? Was he keeping up with his classmates? Marcus answered in short sentences. He said school was fine. His grades were good. He was keeping up. Richard was not satisfied. He pushed for more details. What subjects was Marcus good at? What subjects needed improvement? Had his behavior problems continued at school, or had he finally learned to control himself? Marcus felt the familiar anger rising in his chest. His father always talked about him like he was a broken machine that needed fixing. Never like a son, never like a child who might need patience and understanding. Victoria tried to change the subject. She asked Richard about his trip to Singapore. Did the deal go well? How was the weather there? Richard dismissed her questions with a wave of his hand. He said business was business. He wanted to focus on their son's future. He turned back to Marcus and said he had heard about all the nannies Marcus had driven away. 17 women who could not handle one small boy. Richard said it was embarrassing. It made the family look bad. Marcus gripped his fork tightly. He wanted to throw it across the table. He wanted to scream that maybe the nannies left because they could tell no one in this family actually cared about him. But he remembered Grace's words. He was stronger than he knew. He took a breath and said he was sorry for embarrassing the family. He said things were different now with Grace. Richard laughed coldly. He said this Grace would leave too eventually. They always did. He said Marcus needed to grow up and stop depending on strangers to babysit him. In a few years, Marcus would be sent to boarding school where he would learn discipline and responsibility. No more coddling. Victoria looked uncomfortable. She said they had not decided about boarding school yet. That was still years away. Richard said the decision was already made. His father had sent him to boarding school at 10 years old, and it had made him the man he was today. Marcus would follow the same path. End of discussion. Marcus felt his whole body go cold. Boarding school. Sent away from home. Away from everything familiar. Away from Grace. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He shouted that he was not going to boarding school. He was not going to be sent away like garbage his parents did not want. He ran out of the dining room and up the stairs, ignoring his father's commands to come back. Richard slammed his fist on the table. He told Victoria this was exactly what he was talking about. The boy had no discipline, no respect. Boarding school would fix that. Victoria sat in silence, watching her husband's red face, listening to Marcus's footsteps pounding up the stairs. She felt trapped between a husband who saw their son as a problem to be exported and a son who was clearly hurting. She did not know what to do. She never knew what to do. Upstairs, Marcus burst into his room and threw himself on his bed. He screamed into his pillow until his throat hurt. He punched his mattress over and over until his fists ached. Grace appeared in the doorway. She did not rush to him or try to calm him down with empty words. She simply walked into the room and sat on the edge of his bed. She placed her hand on his back and waited. Marcus eventually stopped screaming. He turned his tear-stained face toward Grace and asked if she knew about boarding school. Did his mother tell her the plan to send him away? Grace said she did not know the details of his parents' plans, but she could see how much the idea upset him. Marcus sat up and wiped his face angrily. He said his father had always hated him. His father looked at him like he was a disappointment. His father wanted to send him away so he would not have to deal with him anymore. Grace listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she asked if she could tell him a story. Marcus shrugged. He said he did not care. Grace told him about her own childhood in Georgia. Her father had been a hard man, too. He worked long hours in a factory and came home tired and angry. He never hit Grace, but he never showed affection either. She grew up thinking she was not good enough to deserve his love. When Grace was 15, her father had a heart attack at work. He died before the ambulance could reach him. Grace never got to hear him say he loved her. She spent years wondering if he ever had. But when she was grown and had her own children, she learned something important. She learned that some people do not know how to show love. They feel it inside, but they do not have the words or the actions to express it. Her father had worked those long hours to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. That was his way of loving, even if it did not feel like love to young Grace. She asked Marcus if it was possible that his father loved him but did not know how to show it. Marcus shook his head firmly. He said his father did not love him. His father loved business. His father loved money and power. But he did not love Marcus. Grace did not argue. She said maybe Marcus was right. She said some people did close themselves off so completely that love could not reach anyone around them. But she also said that did not mean Marcus was unlovable. The problem was with his father, not with Marcus. Marcus looked at Grace with desperate eyes. He asked if she would stay with him. He asked her to promise not to leave like all the others. Grace's heart broke a little. She could not make that promise. She was 60 years old with no savings and no power in this household. Richard Harrison could fire her tomorrow if he decided she was causing problems. She had no control over her own future. But she looked at this broken little boy and said the only thing she could. She said she would stay as long as she possibly could. She said no matter what happened, she would always remember him and care about him. Even if circumstances separated them, he would always have a place in her heart. Marcus hugged her tightly. It was the first time he had hugged anyone in years. Grace held him and let him cry, rocking gently like she had rocked her own children when they were small. Downstairs, Victoria finished her meal in silence while Richard checked his phone and answered work emails. The formal dining room felt cold and empty despite the elegant decorations. Victoria wondered how her life had become this: a husband who treated their son like a business problem, a son who showed more love to a housekeeper than to his own mother. A home that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within. After Richard went to his study to continue working, Victoria climbed the stairs to Marcus's room. She found Grace sitting in the armchair, reading quietly. Marcus was asleep in his bed, his face still red from crying but peaceful in sleep. Victoria whispered to Grace. She asked what had happened. Grace told her simply. She said Marcus was scared about boarding school. He felt like his father did not love him. He needed reassurance that he was not going to be abandoned. Victoria felt the words like accusations, even though Grace spoke without judgment. She asked Grace what she should do. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Victoria needed to spend time with her son. Real time. Not scheduled activities or educational outings. Just sitting with him. Listening to him. Learning who he actually was underneath all the anger. Victoria said she did not know how. She said she had never been good at that kind of thing. Her own mother had been distant and formal. Victoria did not know how to be warm. Grace said warmth could be learned. It started with showing up. It started with putting down the phone and looking into her child's eyes. It started with saying, I love you, and meaning it. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She said she did love Marcus. She just did not know how to make him feel it. Grace said that was the first step. Knowing there was a problem was the beginning of fixing it. She suggested Victoria join them tomorrow afternoon. They could all do something together. Something Marcus enjoyed. Victoria agreed. She did not know if she could change who she was, but she knew she had to try. Her son was slipping away, and if she did not reach for him now, she might lose him forever. The next afternoon, Victoria came home early from work for the first time in months. She went upstairs and found Grace and Marcus in the playroom, building a tower out of wooden blocks. Marcus looked surprised to see her. He asked what she was doing home so early. Victoria said she wanted to spend time with him. She sat down on the floor in her expensive business suit and asked if she could help build the tower. Marcus looked at Grace, uncertain. Grace nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Marcus handed his mother a block. He showed her where it needed to go. Victoria placed it carefully, worried about making a mistake. But when the block fit perfectly, Marcus gave her a small smile. They built together for an hour. Victoria learned that Marcus liked to make the towers as tall as possible before knocking them down. She learned that he had names for different blocks based on their colors and sizes. She learned that he talked more when he was focused on something with his hands. Grace watched from the corner of the room, her heart full of hope and worry at the same time. Hope that this family could heal, worry about what Richard Harrison might do when he realized the changes happening under his roof. The next several days continued in the same pattern. Victoria came home earlier and spent time with Marcus. They built things and drew pictures and read stories together. Richard remained in his study or traveled for business, barely noticing the shift in his household. But on the weekend, Richard finally paid attention. He walked past the playroom and saw Victoria on the floor with Marcus and Grace, all three of them laughing at something. His wife in her casual clothes, her hair down instead of in its usual severe style. His son looking happy instead of angry. And that black woman in the middle of it all, like she belonged in his family. Richard felt something cold settle in his chest. He did not like changes he had not approved. He did not like strangers influencing his wife and son. And he especially did not like the way Marcus looked at Grace with obvious adoration while barely acknowledging his own father. He walked into the room and announced that he was taking Marcus golfing tomorrow. Just the two of them, father and son. It was time they bonded properly. Marcus's face fell. He hated golf. It was boring, and his father got angry whenever Marcus swung the club wrong. He started to protest. Richard cut him off. He said the decision was made. They would leave at 7 in the morning. Marcus should get a good night's sleep. Grace saw the tension building in Marcus's body. She quickly suggested that maybe Victoria could go too. Make it a family outing. Richard shook his head. He said this was between him and his son. Women did not belong on the golf course anyway. He walked out before anyone could respond. That night, Marcus could not sleep. He came to Grace's small room on the second floor, the room meant for staff, far away from the family bedrooms. He asked if he could stay with her for a while. Grace welcomed him in. Her room was simple compared to the rest of the house. A single bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. But it was warm, and it smelled like the lavender lotion Grace used on her hands. Marcus sat on the edge of her bed and confessed his fears. He said golf with his father would be terrible. His father would criticize everything he did. His father would get frustrated and say hurtful things. Marcus would end up angry, and then his father would use that anger as proof that Marcus needed to be sent away. Grace listened to his fears. She acknowledged that they were real and valid. Richard Harrison was not an easy man. Golf with him would probably not be fun. But she also reminded Marcus of his own strength. She reminded him of how far he had come in the past few weeks. He had learned to control his anger, at least sometimes. He had learned that he did not have to react to every insult with violence or rage. He could take a breath. He could let the words pass over him without letting them destroy him. She taught him a trick her mother had taught her. When someone said something hurtful, she imagined the words as leaves falling from a tree. She watched them fall and blow away in the wind. They did not stick to her. They did not become part of her. They were just leaves. Marcus practiced imagining leaves while Grace spoke critical words to him in a gentle voice, pretending to be his father. It felt strange at first, but after several tries, Marcus found that the technique helped. The words still stung, but they did not burn as badly. He went back to his room feeling a little stronger. He still dreaded tomorrow, but he no longer felt completely helpless. The next morning, Richard and Marcus drove to the country club in Richard's expensive sports car. They barely spoke during the drive. Richard listened to business news on the radio while Marcus stared out the window. On the golf course, things went as Marcus had expected. Richard corrected his grip too harshly. Richard sighed loudly every time Marcus missed a shot. Richard made comments about how weak and uncoordinated Marcus was, how he needed to be tougher, how business was not going to be easy for someone who could not even hit a golf ball. Marcus imagined leaves falling, red leaves, yellow leaves, brown leaves. They fell around him and blew away in the breeze. His father's words fell too. They touched him and they hurt, but they did not stick. They floated past and disappeared. By the 9th hole, Richard noticed that Marcus was not reacting to his criticisms. The boy was not crying or screaming or throwing his club like he had done in the past. He was just quiet, focused, almost peaceful. Richard found this unsettling. He pushed harder. He made sharper comments. He compared Marcus unfavorably to other boys at the country club. But nothing worked. Marcus just kept playing, kept missing shots, kept imagining leaves. Finally, Richard asked what was wrong with Marcus. Why was he acting so strange? Marcus looked at his father and said nothing was wrong. He said he was just trying to enjoy the game. Richard stared at his son like he was seeing a stranger. Then he muttered something about that woman having too much influence and walked to the next hole. They finished the round without any explosions. It was not a pleasant day, but it was not a disaster either. Marcus felt proud of himself. He had survived. He had not let his father's cruelty break him. When they got home, Marcus ran straight to Grace's room and told her everything. He demonstrated the leaves technique and how well it had worked. He said his father had been confused and angry that his words did not have their usual effect. Grace hugged him and said she was proud. She said he was learning to protect his heart while keeping it open. That was one of the hardest things any person could learn to do. But even as she celebrated with Marcus, Grace felt a shadow of worry. She had seen the look on Richard Harrison's face when he walked in the door. He was not pleased with the changes in his son. And men like Richard did not accept changes they could not control. Something was coming. Grace could feel it the way she felt storms approaching before the first clouds appeared. She just did not know yet how bad the storm would be. The storm Grace had sensed arrived 3 days after the golf outing. Richard Harrison called a family meeting in his study, a formal room filled with dark leather furniture and walls covered with awards and certificates from his business achievements. Victoria sat in one of the guest chairs looking nervous. Marcus stood by the window, already suspicious about what was coming. Richard sat behind his massive desk and announced his decision. Grace Johnson would be let go at the end of the week. He had already contacted a new agency that specialized in strict, disciplined child care. A proper nanny would arrive next Monday, someone who understood that children needed structure and rules, not arts and crafts and emotional conversations. Victoria immediately protested. She said Grace had been wonderful, Marcus had improved dramatically, there was no reason to make a change. Richard raised his hand to silence her. He said he was the head of this household and his decision was final. He said Grace had turned Marcus soft. The boy needed to be prepared for the real world, not coddled by some old woman who did not understand what it took to succeed in life. Marcus felt the anger rising in his chest like fire. He looked at Grace, who stood quietly by the door, her face calm but her eyes sad. He imagined the leaves falling, but this time they burned before they could blow away. He stepped forward and told his father that he could not fire Grace. He said Grace was the only person who had ever actually cared about him. He said he would run away before he let his father take her away. Richard laughed coldly. He asked where Marcus would run to. He said the boy had no money, no skills, no friends. He would be back within a day, begging to come home. And when that happened, Marcus would not only lose Grace, but also his precious playroom and his video games and everything else he took for granted. Victoria tried again to intervene. She said they should discuss this privately, without making threats in front of Marcus and the staff, but Richard was enjoying his power too much to stop. He told Marcus that this was a lesson in how the world worked. People came and went. Servants were hired and fired. Only family was permanent, and even family had to earn their place. If Marcus wanted to be treated well, he needed to behave well, starting now. Marcus looked at Grace one more time. She gave him a small nod, a signal that it was okay to feel what he was feeling. But she also pressed her hands together in front of her heart, reminding him to stay centered. Marcus took a deep breath. He told his father that he would not scream or throw things or give him the satisfaction of calling him crazy. But he also said he would never forgive this. He said when he was grown up and his father was old and alone, he would remember this day. He would remember that his father chose power over his son's happiness. Then Marcus walked out of the study with dignity he had never shown before. He did not run or slam doors. He simply walked upstairs to his room and closed the door quietly behind him. Richard seemed uncertain for a moment, thrown off by his son's controlled response. Then he hardened his face and told Victoria that the matter was settled. Grace had until Friday. He returned to the papers on his desk, dismissing everyone. Victoria found Grace in the kitchen, packing her few belongings into a small bag. The cook Bernard stood nearby, looking upset. He had grown to appreciate Grace's quiet presence in the house. She had treated him with respect, which was more than most people in this household bothered to do. Victoria apologized to Grace. She said she had tried to change Richard's mind, but he would not listen. She said she would give Grace an excellent reference and 3 months of extra pay. Grace thanked her, but said references and money were not what she was worried about. She was worried about Marcus. The progress he had made was fragile. Without consistent support, he could easily slip back into his old patterns of anger and isolation. Victoria promised to continue spending time with Marcus herself. She said she would be the support he needed. Grace looked at Victoria with eyes that had seen too much to believe easily. She asked if Victoria was ready for that commitment, because Marcus did not need someone who showed up occasionally when it was convenient. He needed someone who would be there every day, through the tantrums and the tears and the slow, difficult work of healing. Victoria did not know how to answer. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to be the mother Marcus deserved. But she knew her own weaknesses. She knew how easily work pulled her away. She knew how tempting it was to let someone else handle the hard parts of parenting. Grace saw the hesitation and sighed softly. She said she would spend her remaining days preparing Marcus as best she could. She would give him tools to cope without her. And she would pray that someone in this family would finally put that little boy first. The next few days were bittersweet. Grace and Marcus spent every moment together. She taught him more coping techniques for his anger. She helped him create a book of his drawings that he could keep hidden from his father. She told him stories about her own life, about the struggles she had overcome, about the strength that lived inside every person who refused to give up. On the last night, Marcus could not sleep. He crept down to Grace's room one final time and found her sitting in her chair by the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. He asked her why the world was so unfair. He asked why people who tried to help got pushed away while people who hurt others got to stay in power. Grace pulled him onto her lap, even though he was really too big for that now. She said the world was full of unfairness. She said powerful people often did cruel things because they had forgotten what really mattered. But she also said that unfairness was not the whole story. Kindness existed too. Love existed. Change was possible, even if it took a long time. She told Marcus about the civil rights movement she had grown up hearing about, how people who had nothing had stood against systems that seemed unbeatable, how small acts of courage had added up over years until the whole country changed. She said nothing was permanent, not injustice, and not the power of cruel men. Marcus asked if his father would ever change. Grace said she did not know. Some people changed, and some people stayed stuck in their ways until they died. But Marcus could not control his father. He could only control himself. He could choose to be different. He could choose to grow into a man who treated people with kindness instead of cruelty. That choice belonged to Marcus alone, and no one could take it from him. Marcus promised that he would be different. He said when he grew up, he would have children, and he would love them properly. He would listen to them and play with them, and never make them feel like disappointments. Grace smiled through her tears. She said she believed him. She said she had seen who Marcus really was, underneath all the anger. He was good. He was creative. He was capable of great love. All he needed was the chance to grow. They sat together until Marcus fell asleep in her arms. Grace carried him back to his bed and tucked him in one last time. She stood in his doorway watching him sleep, memorizing his face, praying silently that life would be kind to him. In the morning, Grace said her goodbyes. Bernard shook her hand and thanked her for bringing some peace to this troubled house. The cleaning ladies hugged her and wished her well. Even the gardener came inside to say farewell to the woman who had always remembered his name and asked about his family. Victoria met Grace at the front door with an envelope full of money and a letter of reference. Her eyes were red from crying. She said she was sorry again. She said she wished things could be different. Grace accepted the envelope, but pressed the letter of reference back into Victoria's hands. She said she did not need a letter. What she needed was for Victoria to keep her promise, to be there for Marcus, to fight for him even when it was hard. The boy needed his mother, not another stranger. Victoria nodded solemnly. She swore she would try her best. Grace looked at Marcus, who stood at the top of the stairs refusing to come down. He had said his goodbyes the night before. He could not bear to watch her walk out the door. Grace understood. She blew him a kiss and mouthed the words, "I love you." Marcus caught the invisible kiss and pressed it to his heart. Then he turned and walked back to his room before the tears could fall. Grace stepped out into the morning sunshine and walked down the long driveway. She did not look back. She had learned long ago that looking back only made leaving harder. The weeks after Grace left were difficult. Marcus withdrew into himself. He spent hours in his room, drawing dark pictures and refusing to speak. Victoria tried to reach him, but he pushed her away. He said she had let Grace go. She had chosen his father over his happiness. He could not trust her. Victoria did not give up. She came home early every day, just as she had when Grace was there. She sat outside Marcus's door and talked to him through the wood. She told him about her day, about her childhood, about her own difficult relationship with her mother. She admitted her failures and apologized for the years of distance. Slowly, Marcus began to respond. First with single words, then with short sentences. Finally, after 3 weeks, he opened his door and let his mother in. They sat on his floor surrounded by his drawings, and Marcus showed her the book Grace had helped him create. Page after page of dragons and ships and lonely figures searching for something precious. Victoria saw her son's pain laid out in images, and she wept. She promised Marcus that things would be different. She promised to protect him from his father's harshness. She promised to fight for what was right, even when it was difficult. Richard noticed the changes in his wife. She was less compliant, more willing to argue. She pushed back when he criticized Marcus. She refused to discuss boarding school. The peaceful wife, who had always deferred to his judgment, was becoming someone with opinions of her own. Richard did not like it. He blamed Grace for planting seeds of rebellion in his household. He demanded that Victoria stop coddling Marcus and support his plan for discipline. When she refused, they argued more and more often. The tension in the house grew thick enough to feel. One night, Richard went too far. He told Marcus that he was a disappointment, that no son of his should be so weak and emotional, that Grace had ruined any chance Marcus had of becoming a real man. Victoria stood up from her chair and told Richard to stop. She said she was done listening to him tear their son apart. She said Marcus was sensitive and creative, and those were gifts, not flaws. She said if Richard could not see the value in his own child, then maybe Richard was the one with the problem. The room went silent. Marcus stared at his mother with wide eyes. He had never seen her stand up to his father before. Richard's face turned red with rage. He told Victoria to remember her place. He said he was the provider, the decision-maker, the head of this family. Without him, they would have nothing. Victoria took a deep breath and said, "Maybe having nothing would be better than having everything with a man who could not love his own son." She took Marcus's hand and walked out of the room. That night, Victoria made a decision that had been building for years. She contacted a lawyer. She began the process of divorce. The legal battle took over a year. Richard fought for everything, not because he wanted custody of Marcus, but because he wanted to win. He hired expensive lawyers who tried to paint Victoria as an unfit mother. He threatened to send Marcus to boarding school overseas where Victoria would never see him. But Victoria had changed. The woman who had once been too scared to disagree with her husband now fought like a lioness protecting her cub. She presented evidence of Richard's emotional abuse. She showed the court Marcus's drawings and the records of 17 nannies who had quit because of the hostile environment in their home. The judge awarded Victoria full custody. Richard was given supervised visitation, which he rarely used. His pride would not let him spend time with his son under the watchful eyes of a court-appointed monitor. Victoria and Marcus moved to a smaller house on the other side of the city. It was modest compared to the mansion, but it was warm and filled with light. Marcus had his own room where he could display his drawings on the walls without fear of criticism. Victoria tracked down Grace's address through Martha and wrote her a long letter. She described everything that had happened: the divorce, the custody battle, the new beginning. She thanked Grace for being the catalyst for change. She invited Grace to visit whenever she wanted. Grace wrote back with joy and tears. She said she had prayed for Marcus every day since leaving. She said she was proud of Victoria for finding her courage. She accepted the invitation to visit. The reunion happened on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Marcus, now 9 years old, saw Grace walking up the path to their new house. He ran outside and threw himself into her arms, nearly knocking her down. He had grown taller but still fit perfectly in her embrace. Grace looked at Victoria standing in the doorway, smiling through tears. She saw a woman transformed. The nervous, distant mother had become someone strong and present. Victoria had finally learned what Grace had tried to teach her. That love was not about money or schedules or being perfect. It was about showing up again and again, even when it was hard. That afternoon, the three of them sat in the small backyard and talked for hours. Marcus showed Grace his newest drawings, which had become brighter and more hopeful since leaving his father's house. Victoria told Grace about her new job at a non-profit organization that helped families in crisis. She was using her business skills to make a real difference in the world instead of just making money. Grace shared her own news. She had started volunteering at a community center, teaching art to children from difficult homes. Many of them reminded her of Marcus, angry on the outside, aching for love on the inside. She used the same techniques that had worked with Marcus, sitting with them, listening to them, treating them like people whose feelings mattered. As the sun began to set, Marcus asked Grace if she would come back to work for them. He said he missed her every day. Grace smiled and shook her head gently. She said she was not a nanny anymore. Her work now was bigger than one family. But she promised to visit often, and she promised that no matter where she was, Marcus would always have a place in her heart. Marcus nodded. He understood. He was learning that love did not require possession, that people could be apart and still carry each other with them. Before Grace left that evening, she gave Marcus one final gift. It was a small painting she had made herself, of a red dragon flying toward a beautiful island in the distance. The dragon had finally found its home. Marcus hung the painting above his bed, where he could see it every morning when he woke up and every night before he went to sleep. It reminded him of everything Grace had taught him, that he was worthy of love, that his feelings mattered, that he had the strength to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. Years passed. Marcus grew into a thoughtful young man who channeled his emotions into art. He went to college for fine arts, despite the voice in his head that sometimes still sounded like his father saying artists were weak. Victoria cheered at his graduation with tears in her eyes. Grace attended too, sitting in the audience with her gray hair now fully white. She had watched Marcus grow from a distance, through letters and phone calls and occasional visits. She had seen him struggle and triumph. She had prayed for him through every challenge. After the ceremony, Marcus found Grace in the crowd and hugged her tight. He thanked her for saving his life. He said he knew now that he would have been lost without her. All those years ago, when every nanny had faced his wrath and fled, Grace had stayed. She had seen past his anger to the scared little boy underneath. She had believed in him when no one else would. Grace told him that she had not saved him. She had simply helped him find his own strength. The courage and kindness that he showed the world now had always been inside him. She had just helped him clear away the pain so he could see it. Marcus went on to become a successful artist and art therapist. He worked with troubled children, using the same techniques Grace had used with him, sitting with them, listening to them, treating them like human beings whose feelings mattered. He married a kind woman and had 2 children of his own, whom he loved fiercely and openly. He never let them doubt for a moment that they were precious. Richard Harrison died alone in the mansion on Maple Avenue. His business empire had collapsed due to bad decisions and unpaid debts. His health had failed. His second wife had left him for a younger man. At the end, he had nothing but his pride, and even that was hollow. Marcus did not attend the funeral, but he did visit the grave a few months later, standing in the cold cemetery with his hands in his pockets. He did not feel anger anymore. The anger had burned away long ago, replaced by something that felt almost like pity. He told his father that he forgave him, not for Richard's sake, but for his own. Carrying anger was exhausting. Letting it go was freedom. Grace had taught him that. Then Marcus placed a single flower on the grave and walked away. He went home to his family. He hugged his children and kissed his wife. He called Grace to tell her about his day. And he thanked God for the black maid who had seen a broken little boy and decided to stay, not because she was paid to, not because it was easy, but because she believed that every child deserved to be loved. And that belief had changed everything. Grace Johnson passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87. Marcus was holding her hand when she took her last breath. He told her he loved her. He told her she had been more of a parent to him than anyone else in his life. He told her she was going home to the island where the dragon lived, where everything was beautiful and nothing hurt anymore. Grace smiled one last time. Then she was gone. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she had touched. Children she had helped at the community center, now grown with families of their own. Neighbors who remembered her kindness. Friends who loved her gentle wisdom. Marcus stood at the front and gave the eulogy. He told the story of a little boy who had been filled with rage because he thought no one loved him. He told how one woman had refused to give up on that boy, even when everyone else had. He said Grace had taught him that love was not about blood or duty or obligation. Love was a choice you made every day, a choice to show up, a choice to stay. He ended by reading a quote that Grace had written in one of her letters to him years ago. The words hung in the air like a blessing. Every child is born with a light inside them. Sometimes that light gets covered up by pain and fear and anger. But the light is still there, waiting. All it needs is someone patient enough to help uncover it. Someone kind enough to keep believing until the child can believe in themselves. That is what love does. It uncovers the light. Marcus looked at the audience through his tears. Grace Johnson had uncovered his light, and he had spent his whole life since then trying to do the same for others. That was her legacy. That was her gift. That was the power of one ordinary woman who refused to give up on an extraordinary little boy. The end.